Howdy everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Understanding Neovim. It's episode number 10, and in this one we are finally going to be closing off our LSP journey. We started off setting up LSP, we then moved on to automatically installing LSPs with Mason, then we moved on to blink.cmp, and now finally we're clearing things up and adding the finishing touches in this episode. So without stalling, let's jump right into our Neovim editors. So here I am in our plugins.lua file, which we've been working on for several episodes at this point. And I have good news. That good news is mason-lspconfig.envim is broken. Okay, sure, you might be asking how on earth is that good news? Well, it actually is. And to show you why, let's actually update all of our plugins to begin with. The way we can do this is by running the lazy sync command. So I'm going to go down here, I'm going to type lazy sync, press enter, and it's now going to update all of our plugins. And here you can see we get a big message saying breaking changes and that mason-lspconfig.envim has had breaking changes. Now, if I press Q, I exit Neovim and I re-enter Neovim, we now get an error message, and that error message states that it attempted to call a field setup_handlers a nil value. So let's try and infer what this error really means. Nil in Lua means nothing. It essentially means that something does not exist. So with that logic, we can really easily figure out that setup_handlers, a function that we obviously must be calling somewhere, is now nil, which means it no longer exists. And we even get told on what line number, 87. So let's go there. I'm here on line 87, and we can indeed see that we're calling the setup handlers. We're setting up all of our LSP servers. So why does this no longer exist? Well, to see that, let's go over to the changelog on the website and let's see what sort of changes they made. So here I am at the mason-lspconfig.envim repository, and as you can see, just 17 hours ago there was a breaking release, now on version 2.0.0. So let's click on that, and here we can see an entire changelog of what changes were made. And down here in the removed features section, we can see that they removed the handlers setting and the .setupHandlers function, so that explains our error message. It has been replaced by the new native lspconfig API and a new automatic enable setting. And down at the bottom here we can also see that this new automatic enable setting is by default activated. So how on earth is this good news? Well, in the previous episode I said that since Neovim 0.11 we have epic changes related to LSP, and that is that you can automatically set up LSP servers from a plugin instead of having to force the user to do it in their configuration. And this new breaking update to mason-lspconfig prevents us from setting up the LSPs manually because we no longer need to do that, and it instead just sets them up for us behind the scenes. Just like blink.cmp configures various LSP related things like capabilities behind the scenes, mason-lspconfig now just configures the servers for us, which is so cool. And back to our configuration, how do we fix the error? We fix the error by just deleting this entire line of code. We just remove this, save and quit, re-enter Neovim, and now everything should work as it did before. You will see that we no longer get warning diagnostics, which might be a bit suspicious. However, all you need to do is make a simple change to the file and the LSP is now going to kick in again and is going to display all of the warnings. Speaking of which, how do we even remove these annoying warnings? That's what we're going to focus on for the rest of this video. But before we can do that, it would be nice if we could even see the warning in the first place. We see that all of these Vim words are underlined in orange, and we also see in the sign column on the left a bunch of W symbols, which we can assume stands for warning, but we can't actually see the warning. So how do we do that? Well, to do that, we need to configure Neovim Diagnostics. A diagnostic is simply a message tied to a buffer, more specifically a region of a buffer. Now, diagnostics can have several severities attached to them. The most basic is trace, which is just a general message. You've got info, which is an informatory message, warnings, errors, and I believe there's also one layer above errors, but I don't know, don't quote me on that. So we're going to do something crazy. We're going to move back to the options.lua file, which we haven't touched for I think 8 or 9 episodes, and we're going to add a new setting there. So here we are in our options.lua file. Geez, we haven't been here for a while. I'm going to move to the bottom here, and we're going to add a new section. In a comment, I'm just going to write setup diagnostics, which is going to signal to us that the code after this point sets up diagnostic information. And we are going to run the following command, vim.diagnostic.config. And inside of this function invocation, we're going to create a table, and inside of here we can place any configuration related to Vim Diagnostics that we might be interested in. If you want to see all of the options, then there of course is a help page for this specific function. You can go read it. However, we're only interested in 2 very specific options. We're interested in virtual_text, which I'm just going to set to true for now, and virtual_lines, which I'm going to set to false. These are 2 options that you can set individually in order to control how you want your diagnostics to be displayed in a given buffer. So let's start off with the virtual text being equal to true, and then we'll move on to see how virtual lines actually looks. So I'm going to save and quit the current file. I'm going to re-enter the options.lua file, and we're going to make a change in the buffer to let the LSP kick in. And now what you can see is because we configured the diagnostics down here to display warnings and various other diagnostics as virtual text, it's going to display everything at the very end of the line. Now it looks very messy because we have a bunch of warnings on separate lines, which just makes it look horrendous. However, in regular files, this looks much tamer and much cleaner. There is, however, a problem to this approach. It's of course personal preference. However, in my opinion, this is subpar because if you have long lines of code or generally long lines of text, these diagnostics are going to be way off on the right hand side of the screen, and that's not particularly nice to look at, which is why I personally enabled the virtual lines option instead. So I'm going to go down here and I'm just going to delete this virtual text option because I'm not going to be personally using it for this configuration. If you like it, you can keep it. And instead, I'm going to set virtual_lines equal to true. And now when I do that, save and quit and re-enter options.lua yet again, edit the file to let everything kick in, you can now see that our diagnostics are displayed on virtual lines. So lines that don't actually exist in the buffer, however, rendered very nicely in between the lines. This is also much better if you use a language like Rust, which loves to spit out pages upon pages of error messages. Then this makes it so much nicer to read. Okay, so we have our diagnostics sorted. So now let's finally fix the actual underlying problem, which is this undefined global Vim. Why does this even happen? The Lua language server, of course, isn't just made for Neovim. It's made for any sort of Lua project. For that reason, it makes absolutely no assumptions about what sort of code base you're in. What we're dealing with here is a global because we're never defining this variable anywhere. It just kind of magically exists inside of this file. And the Lua LSP obviously isn't able to find that because it doesn't even know where to start looking. And so we need to find a way to tell the Lua language server that a Vim global exists in our code. Not only that, it would be even better if we could show it what this Vim global actually does and what it contains. That way we could get various auto completions for things like the Vim API and also for various options. That would be awesome. Now, of course, there exists a plugin that solves all of these problems for us automatically, and we're going to be using that in this series. It's called Lazydev.envim. However, we're of course not going to stop there. We're going to take it a step further. I'm going to explain how you could emulate this behavior, at least on a very basic and conceptual level, without having to use such a plugin. Of course, we're going to stick to the plugin because automatic is better than manual in this case, as Lazydev also handles many edge cases which you really don't want to bother with. And voila, here is the Lazydev.envim GitHub website. It's a faster Lua LS setup for Neovim, currently on version 1.9. You can read through its features here. What we're interested in is the removal of the warning related to the Vim global not existing, and also various auto completions for our Lua configuration. So over in the installation section, we can see that the setup is detailed here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to copy paste it, do just a little bit of explanation, and then go from there. Over in my plugins.lua, let's move down to the very bottom. Let's add a new plugin and let's get cracking. So the first thing you will see is this ft equals Lua. Not going to go into too much detail on this because this is related to lazy loading, which is a big topic. I'll be dedicating a video to that. But what you need to know in this case is this is going to make the plugin only load whenever you enter a Lua file. And this is particularly useful because you don't want the plugin to load every time, especially since this plugin is only concerned with Lua functionality. So what this is going to do is going to make sure that the plugin doesn't load and doesn't take up any of our startup time or resources until we actually need it. Here we have the ops field, which I've explained in the previous episode, and we provide a library definition over here. This gives us a sneak peek into the internals of Lazydev and how it functions, but what we're really interested in is what this means. Is that whenever Lazydev locates a vim.uv, this percentage sign here is just to escape the dot character. It's related to Lua pattern matching. If you know what regex is, this is simply escaping the dot. If you don't know, don't worry. Think of this as existing without the $sign symbol. So whenever it finds the text vim.uv in any sort of buffer, it's going to load this specific library, which is related to the libuv library. If you recall, all the way back when we first installed Neovim, there was indeed this section about vim.uv over here. And I did explain that it is way too complicated at that point to start, and I still believe that it is way too complicated to explain even now 10 episodes in. I assume the reason we do this is because the libuv library is fairly large. We don't want to unnecessarily use up our time loading all of those symbols if we don't actually need to. So think of this as another lazy loading measure that Lazydev.envim uses. As I said, this plugin is going to automatically configure the Lua language server to understand the Vim global, understand its contents, and also provide us with auto completions that we can use inside of our config. So we're going to save and quit, re-enter, let Lazy do all of the downloading, and if I press Q and I edit the file, you should now see that we no longer get warnings related to the Vim symbol. In fact, if I go over here and I press Shift K, which is going to open up the hover menu, you can see that the Lua language server now identifies Vim as a massive table containing many entries, including the API, but also other things. For instance, the vim.command table, which we actually already use inside of our codebase over here when we set up the color scheme. It understands that this is now a table that allows us to execute Vim script commands. How nice is that? Now you'll see we have yet another warning. This is related to Nvim treesitter, and it's actually a mistake on Nvim treesitter's end. To my knowledge, I think they updated their type definitions a little too early, as they're doing an internal refactor currently. They're rewriting the entirety of Nvim treesitter to be faster and better. So for now, we're just going to ignore this warning, but if I do figure out a nice and convenient way of solving this, I'll be sure to notify you in the next episode. So for now, we're just going to have to live with this specific warning from one warning to another. And one thing I'd like to draw your attention to as well is that Lua language server has now been configured to also understand all of the plugins that we have installed, which is so cool. For instance, if I press Shift K on this mason.setup, it actually shows me that it's a function with a config entry, and that config entry has a type of mason settings. So it now understands and is capable of giving us much better error messages and also auto completions. Speaking of auto completions, do we have those? Well, actually, you might be surprised to see that they work. If I go down here and I type require mason, you can see it's identified as a file. Even mason-lspconfig is identified. But that isn't actually enough for us in this specific case, because we need a special integration, which is the Lazydev source. If we go back to the website, you will see that there is an optional blink completion source for require statements and module annotations, which we can set up. What it's actually asking us to do is it's asking us to add a new source to blink.cmp called Lazydev, and it's also asking us to set up a new provider, which is going to be Lazydev itself. So let's do that. I'm going to copy this providers section over here, which I think ends right there. I'm going to move back into our configuration. We're going to scroll down to the blink.cmp config, and under default over here, we're just going to paste what Lazydev asks us to paste. And then up here in the default sources, we're going to link Lazydev in all lowercase letters, and that should conclude our blink.cmp configuration. What this is telling blink.cmp to do is telling it to set up a new source called Lazydev, and it's asking it to look for code related to that source in this specific module. So it's going to look in lazydev.integrations.blink, and it's also giving this source a score offset of 100. This score offset means that Lazydev completions are going to be ranked higher in the search results. So if I open up the completion menu, Lazydev related completions are going to exist at the very top over here because they're given the highest score offset. All right, with all of that set up, let's save and quit, re-enter Neovim. Now let's see if everything's working. So here, if you try and hover over something, you might get this workspace loading. That's just the Lua language server enumerating everything for us. But if I press Shift K on anything, you will see that we get all of the proper hovering, so that all still works. I go down here and I do require mason. You can see that now we get a different kind of completion, which is not a file completion anymore like we used to have, but now is an actual code completion. And you can even see in the documentation window that it comes from the mason.nvim plugin. So that concludes everything I wanted to do for this episode. I currently consider our LSP setup to be complete. Not only is it complete, but over the course of Neovim's development cycle, we've actually gotten more and more improvements to LSP, making it even simpler to use now. I still hope that the previous episodes are useful to you, because all of that manual setup that we did is still very beneficial. It still teaches you a lot. But I think it's amazing that Neovim is adapting to the current times and is just making everything work out of the box. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode where I'd like to discuss keybinds and how to set those up. Ciao!